For centuries, the archipelago we now call Indonesia was the crown jewel of the spice world. Cloves, nutmeg, pepper, the world's most desired commodities, grew only here. But this paradise would soon become a battlefield, not of armies, but of commerce and cruelty. At the center of it all, a company, ruthless, rich, and relentless. This is the story of the Dutch East India Company and its brutal rule over Indonesia. A story of conquest, of profit over people, and of resistance that still echoes through time. Welcome to Historical Channel, uncovering untold stories, hidden facts, and the strangest chapters of history. The year was 1602. Europe was on fire with ambition. Kings, popes, and merchants competed not just for land, but for trade. And at the very center of this race were spices. Nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, rare, fragrant, and precious. A pinch could preserve meat or cure illness. A sack could make a man rich. But these treasures didn't grow in Europe. They came from thousands of miles away, from a distant, sun-drenched chain of islands in Southeast Asia. The Europeans called them the Spice Islands, the Moluccas. For over a century, the Portuguese had controlled these trade routes, but their empire was weakening and others were watching. Among them, a small but rising maritime power, the Dutch Republic. In 1595, 4 Dutch ships set sail under Cornelis de Houtman on a desperate and dangerous journey. After a year at sea, facing storms, disease, and betrayal, they reached Banten in western Java. The voyage was a financial disaster, but it proved one thing: the Dutch could reach the Indies without the Portuguese. More expeditions followed. Rival Dutch merchants rushed to the East Indies. They sabotaged each other's deals, bribed local rulers, and slashed prices. Profits plunged, violence erupted, and so the Dutch statesman took a bold step. In March 1602, the States General, the Dutch Parliament, approved the creation of a single, unified trading company. They called it the Verenigde Oostindische Compagnie, the VOC, or the Dutch East India Company. It was unlike anything the world had seen before. The VOC was granted sweeping powers. It could mint its own money, build forts, maintain armies, and even wage war, all in the name of profit. This wasn't just a company. It was a state within a state, a private empire with a corporate charter. The VOC began with 6 chambers across the Netherlands, each managed by powerful merchant families. Thousands of investors, from aristocrats to blacksmiths, poured money into the venture. It became the world's first publicly traded corporation. In return, they received shares and the promise of immense wealth from the East. Over the next century, those promises would be kept, but at a terrible cost. By 1605, it seized Ambon from the Portuguese, then Tidore, Ternate, and parts of Banda. The VOC promised partnership to local sultans, but behind every treaty was the barrel of a musket. Indigenous rulers were pressured, deceived, or removed. Rival traders, English, Spanish, Chinese, and Arab, were driven out or eliminated. A monopoly was forming, enforced not by diplomacy, but domination. But the company paid a price too. Mortality on VOC voyages was staggering. 2 out of every 3 sailors died on the journey, from scurvy, dysentery, or sheer exhaustion. Ships were packed with weapons, cargo, and desperate men. Many would never return home. Yet the profits were so enormous, the risks seemed worth it. Nutmeg sold in Amsterdam for 30 times what it cost in Banda. Pepper lined the pockets of Dutch elites. And so, the machine kept turning. As the VOC expanded, it sent out not just ships, but governors, soldiers, and clerks. This was the beginning of something bigger. A long, brutal occupation that would stretch for over 3 centuries. The Dutch were no longer mere traders. They were becoming rulers, and Indonesia was becoming a colony of capital. In the early 17th century, no place was more precious to the VOC than the island of Ambon. Located in the fabled Maluku Islands, this was the heart of the global clove trade, and whoever controlled Ambon controlled the spice market. But control would not be won through treaties alone. The Dutch had come to dominate, and in Ambon, they would show just how far they were willing to go. In 1605, the VOC wrested Ambon from the Portuguese, establishing Fort Victoria as their new stronghold. From there, they began a methodical campaign, not just to control territory, but to strangle all competition. Indigenous traders were forced to sell only to the Dutch at prices set by the Dutch. Fields were destroyed if they exceeded VOC quotas. Trees were cut down, villages burned, alliances broken. Ambon had become a laboratory of monopoly enforced by terror. By 1623, tensions on the island reached a boiling point. The local population, already bitter under VOC rule, had long resented the company's harsh taxes and brutal enforcement. The English, who maintained a small outpost on Ambon under the English East India Company, were also in uneasy alliance, tolerated but watched. That year, a Malay soldier, reportedly caught stealing, was tortured. Under extreme duress, he confessed to a conspiracy involving the English and several Japanese mercenaries. Whether real or fabricated, the confessions set off a chain of horror. Dutch Governor Herman van Spelt launched a full-scale purge. Over the next several days, 20 men were arrested, 10 Japanese, 10 Englishmen, accused of plotting to seize Fort Victoria and assassinate the Dutch. They were subjected to unspeakable torture, waterboarding, burning, mutilation. Under agony, they confessed to whatever the Dutch demanded. And then, one by one, they were executed. Heads rolled into baskets. The gallows stood tall. The beaches of Ambon ran red. The event became known as the Amboina Massacre. When news of the massacre reached London, the outrage was immediate. The English East India Company accused the VOC of cold-blooded murder. The Dutch, in turn, claimed the executions were lawful, that a real conspiracy had been uncovered. King James I of England and the Staten General of the Netherlands exchanged angry letters. But the truth was buried beneath politics and profit. There was no trial, no independent inquiry. And while relations between the Dutch and English soured for years, the massacre had one undeniable result. The VOC had cemented its absolute authority over Ambon. After the massacre, the English retreated. Indigenous leaders who once resisted now bowed in fear. The VOC expanded its monopoly, setting prices, destroying unauthorized groves, and forcing Ambonese farmers into binding contracts. This was the VOC's new model, a system of control that combined military force, economic domination, and psychological terror. The events in Ambon would not be the last time they used this strategy, but it was the first time the world saw the true face of the Dutch East India Company. Beneath the numbers, behind the trade routes, were people, caught in the jaws of empire. On Ambon, every clove was picked with hands that remembered the killings. Every Dutch coin carried the weight of suffering, and every whisper of resistance risked death. This was not commerce. This was colonization, with a corporate logo. In the early 17th century, the Dutch East India Company had ports across the archipelago. But they lacked a true capital, a stronghold, a seat of power that could anchor their rule and expand their ambitions. That would change with one man. His name was Jan Pieterszoon Cohen. Born in Hoorn in 1587, Cohen was a merchant, an accountant, and a zealot. He believed in the power of trade, but also in the righteousness of Dutch domination. "We cannot make war without trade, nor trade without war," he once wrote. At just 31 years old, he was appointed Governor-General of the VOC, and he had a vision to turn a small Javanese port called Jayakarta into the capital of a Dutch empire. Jayakarta was strategically vital. Nestled near the Sunda Strait, it linked the Indian Ocean to the spice routes. But the Dutch were not alone. The city's rulers, under the Sultanate of Banten, were allied with the English East India Company. Tensions grew. Skirmishes broke out. In 1619, Cohen made his move. On May 30th, 1619, Cohen led a brutal siege. Jayakarta was razed to the ground. Homes were torched, men and women slaughtered. The English were expelled. The local Javanese population, once partners, were enslaved, exiled, or killed. And on these ashes, Cohen founded a new city. A city not of Asia, but of Europe. He called it Batavia, named after the legendary Germanic tribe from which the Dutch claimed descent. Batavia was built in the image of Amsterdam. Neat canals carved through steamy jungle. Red tiled roofs replaced bamboo huts. Fort Castile Batavia towered over the harbor, the beating heart of VOC power. From here, the company would direct all trade, enforce all laws, and crush all resistance. Cohen turned Batavia into a factory of imperialism. But Batavia was not built by the Dutch alone. Thousands of enslaved people, Javanese, Balinese, Bugis, Ambonese, and even Africans and Indians, were forced to construct the city. Disease swept through the canals. The air reeked of decay. For every building that rose, dozens of bodies fell. But Cohen did not flinch. His goal was not prosperity for the Indies, but dominance for the Netherlands. Yet Cohen's most horrific legacy was not Batavia. It was the bloodbath he orchestrated on the Banda Islands. The Bandanese produced the world's finest nutmeg, and they refused to sell exclusively to the VOC. In 1621, Cohen led a full-scale invasion. Over 14,000 people lived on Banda. Within months, only a few hundred remained. Cohen ordered massacres, deportations, and enslavement. Whole villages were burned to ash. Men were beheaded in the streets. Women and children were sold into slavery. The Banda Massacre was one of the most brutal episodes in colonial history. Cohen called it necessary. The Dutch called it victory. And the VOC secured a total monopoly on nutmeg. Not all of Indonesia bowed quietly to the Dutch. For every port seized, for every treaty signed in blood, there were voices that rose in defiance. And in the heart of Java, one voice thundered louder than any other: Sultan Agung of Mataram. Born in 1593, Sultan Agung rose to the throne of the Mataram Sultanate in 1613. A brilliant strategist, philosopher, and poet, he envisioned a united Java, free from foreign interference. As the VOC tightened its grip on coastal ports, Sultan Agung turned inland power into military might. His ambition was not only to expand Mataram, but to crush the Dutch, who he saw as invaders with no rightful place on Javanese soil. In 1628, Sultan Agung made his boldest move yet, a full-scale military campaign against the VOC's capital. Tens of thousands of Mataram soldiers advanced toward Batavia. Sultan Agung's goal was clear: burn the city, expel the Dutch, end the company. The siege began, a thunder of gongs, arrows, and war cries echoing across the marshlands. But the walls of Batavia held. The Dutch, under Governor-General John Pieterszoon Cohen, had fortified the city with European precision. Disease and poor logistics weakened Sultan Agung's massive army. His supply lines were too long, his siege weapons outdated. After weeks of fierce fighting, the Mataram forces retreated. But the war was not over. In 1629, Sultan Agung tried again, a second siege of Batavia. This time, he cut Dutch supply routes from the sea. He attacked Dutch allies. He tightened the noose. But again, the fortress held. Cohen died that year, likely of dysentery, but not from Sultan Agung's blade. Though Sultan Agung failed to take Batavia, he succeeded in something greater, proving that the VOC could be resisted and that Java would never be fully theirs. Sultan Agung reigned until 1645, expanding Mataram into the most powerful Javanese kingdom in history. To this day, he is remembered not only as a king, but as a symbol of unbroken resistance. Sultan Agung was not alone. Across the archipelago, brave men and women rose up against the VOC's ruthless grip. In 1650, Kapitan Patimura, a former VOC soldier from Ambon, led a legendary revolt against the Dutch. His fighters seized Fort Doorstede and executed VOC officials. The revolt was ultimately crushed, and Patimura was hanged in 1817. But his name lives on as a hero of independence. In South Sulawesi, the Bugis and Makassar peoples resisted Dutch trade domination for decades. The Kingdom of Gawa, under Sultan Hasanuddin, fought valiantly during the 1660s. Hasanuddin was nicknamed the Rooster of the East by the Dutch for his fierce and untamed defiance. Though his forces were eventually overwhelmed, he negotiated peace on his own terms. Each act of resistance was met with savage retaliation. The VOC adopted a brutal policy: destroy one to silence 100. Villages suspected of rebellion were burned. Crops were salted. Leaders were executed in public squares. Native courts were infiltrated. Spies were planted. Alliances shattered. The company ruled not through consent, but through intimidation, coercion, and terror. For the Dutch East India Company, war was just a means. The real prize was spice: clove, nutmeg, mace, cinnamon, pepper. Products once local to the archipelago became worth more than gold in Europe, and the VOC would do anything to control them. In the 1600s, the world's supply of nutmeg came almost entirely from a handful of volcanic islands, the Banda Islands. Mace, the dried, lacy covering of nutmeg, was even more valuable. When Bandanese traders refused to sell exclusively to the Dutch, thousands were killed, the survivors enslaved. And in the vacuum, the company planted something far more sinister: a spice monopoly. VOC soldiers cleared the land and installed plantations, known as perkin, for nutmeg. Dutch planters, or perkineers, ran them like fiefdoms, using forced labor. Hundreds of people worked each plot, under armed guard. They were not paid. They could not leave. They were property. The VOC controlled the fields, the harvest, the ports, and the prices. The Banda Islands became a factory of profit and a graveyard of freedom. But the Banda Islands were just the beginning. In Ambon, Ternate, Tidore, Makassar, the VOC repeated the same pattern: buy exclusive contracts, use force when needed, destroy any trees outside their control. The Dutch called it extirpatie, the systematic destruction of spice trees grown without VOC permission. If a village planted even one clove tree illegally, the Dutch torched the grove. If a ruler broke contract, they were exiled or executed. Whole communities were punished for disobedience. Crops were uprooted, livelihoods erased. Indigenous trade networks, once thriving between islands, China, India, and Arabia, were strangled. Trade was no longer free. The VOC dictated who could buy, who could sell, and at what price. The markets of Maluku, Java, and Sumatra turned from vibrant exchanges into colonial choke points, and every island became just one more cog in a merciless machine. As the VOC enriched itself, Indonesian farmers were plunged into poverty. Instead of feeding their families, they were ordered to grow what the VOC demanded. Rice gave way to pepper, sago to clove, but famine followed, because spice doesn't feed mouths, and money never made it back to the people. In Europe, VOC shares soared. In Indonesia, famine and unrest spread. Even those not enslaved were trapped in a cycle of debt, tax, and punishment. The company profited from poverty and ensured it never ended. For over 150 years, the VOC maintained its spice stranglehold, but even monopolies decay. By the mid-18th century, corruption, overexpansion, and global competition eroded VOC power. Spices no longer held the same value in Europe. The company began to collapse under the weight of its own greed. But long before the VOC's official bankruptcy in 1799, it had already bankrupted the soul of the archipelago. The Dutch East India Company wasn't just a trading firm. It was the world's first corporate empire. Its legacy was not only measured in coins, but in the forests burned, cultures erased, and economies shattered. Indonesia's rich traditions of barter, cooperation, and maritime exchange were choked by monopoly. But in the ashes of exploitation, the memory of resistance remained. A memory that would one day fuel a revolution. In 1799, after nearly 200 years of empire, the Dutch East India Company collapsed. Its debts were astronomical. Its stock was worthless. Its charter was revoked. The Dutch government, weakened by revolution in Europe, nationalized what was left. But Batavia did not celebrate. The chains had not been broken. They had only been transferred. The VOC disappeared. But the system it built, the plantations, the prisons, the class divide, remained. And the people of Indonesia were still not free. For over 300 years, the islands now called Indonesia lived under foreign rule. First as a trade prize, then as a possession, always as something to be owned. The VOC may have died in 1799, but the Dutch state simply stepped in to take its place. Java, Sumatra, Kalimantan, Sulawesi, Maluku, Papua, all were absorbed into the Dutch East Indies, a new colonial system built on the bones of the old. And yet, so did resistance. From Aceh to Bali, from Sulawesi to Timor, uprisings flared. Farmers revolted. Poets wrote in code. Students organized in secret. Names like Diponegoro, Kartini, Haji Misbah, and Ki Hajar Dewantara emerged. Voices refusing to be erased. They remembered the violence of Ambon, the cruelty of Batavia, the rebellion of Sultan Agung, and slowly, they built a new dream: freedom. From Java's rice fields to the jungles of Papua, Indonesia reclaimed its voice, not through a single war, but through decades of persistence. In 1945, Sukarno declared independence, but the shadow of colonialism did not vanish overnight. History is not a closed book. It is a mirror. And when we look into it, we must ask, what kind of empire do we see? The VOC was not simply a company. It was an engine of conquest, powered by profit, protected by violence, and polished by silence. And yet, its rule was never total. For every contract signed in Batavia, a rebellion stirred in the forests. For every map drawn in Amsterdam, a boundary was crossed by the brave. Colonialism may have lasted centuries, but so did the resistance. So did the will to survive. So did the memory. The story of Indonesia under the Dutch East India Company is not only a tale of brutality, it is a testament to endurance, to to defiance, to the power of truth. And now at last, the world is beginning to listen.